Well, hello everyone. I'm excited to have for this month feature on the Historical Faith Society, Dr. Randall Price, and we're going to be talking about the hidden caves of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So Randall, let's just talk about the significance of this archaeological site at Qumran.
Well, there's hardly any comparison to Qumran in terms of the history of archaeology. And the reason for that is because here we have a site that existed 100 years or so before the birth of Jesus, during his lifetime, and then at the beginning of the foundation of the early church. And it was a Jewish sect, a very orthodox Jewish sect, that we didn't even know existed in history. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, all the people mentioned in the pages of the New Testament left no writings. We have no real records that come from them. But here we discovered a group that were like them and even spoke about them, that recorded in great detail things about the culture, the times, using language that was reminiscent of what we see in the pages of the New Testament, and particularly archiving copies of the Bible, leaving us the oldest copies of the Bible that we have in existence. And that, of course, was extremely significant because up until the time with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest copies we have are about 1,000 years. And people were very skeptical as to how accurate the transmission of the biblical text might have been. But with the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that knowledge was pushed back another more than 1,000 years. We could compare the text, and one thing we can now argue is that the Bible that has come to us was very accurately and very reliably transmitted, so that we can take our text and say it's a trustworthy text. But beyond that, we have very interesting things, commentaries on the biblical text, writings about the ideas in the biblical text that had not yet come to fulfillment, and prophetic statements. Almost everything we see coming from the Dead Sea community is prophetic in nature. They're dealing with the biblical prophecies, and you remember that Jesus himself said, you don't know the prophets. The problem was they read the law, but they didn't read the prophets. This group majored on the prophets, and we have now an understanding of what people before and during the time of Jesus actually knew about the coming of the Messiah and the things that God had promised. And there's just nothing like the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that's why we have entire departments and some of the leading universities of the world dedicated to the Dead Sea Scroll and its research.
So what I'd like to do is, we've got some aerial footage that you supplied us. Let's just take a look at this site, because you spent quite a bit of time at the plateau right in front of where the caves are. So can we roll that footage and let's take a look at it? What is this area here?
All right, we're coming from the south going toward the north. You're looking at the Qumran cliffs. These are the marl cliffs made out of a soft kind of chalky material. You see Cave 4, one of the famous caves. There are other caves around from that, and on the other side of that, the flat area is the Qumran Plateau, situated between the Wadi Qumran, which is a kind of a dry riverbed right now, but also holds water, and then the cemetery, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. So all the little pockmarked areas are tombs. About 1,000 people were buried there. This plateau is where I excavated for 10 years, but now you're seeing in the scene pictures of buildings. These were excavated by Roland DeVoe and his team from 1951 to 1957. And that's what people go to see as tourists, these buildings that were related to the Dead Sea community. Now we're moving beyond that up toward the west, and you're looking upward in the cliffs, and those caves up there, just around the corner from the one that's in view, is where the next cave we're going to excavate is. It's called Cave 61. And so these caves are caves that were dug in the marl, or let's say widened in some of these breccia, this type of very loose limestone. They're created geologically, and then they're widened by human occupation. But for the most part, the hiding caves, and you can see already just small little indentations in all of this. The famous cave we excavated, Cave 53 or Cave 12, is just down on the left-hand side, a little far from view right now, but it's there, coming into view just beyond this slide of rock that's come down. All of these areas have caves.
It looks like there's hundreds of caves here. How many caves are there?
Well, they've estimated as many as 600 caves. A lot of these are just natural caves. A lot of them were caves used in the First and Second Jewish Revolt when Jews fleeing from the Romans. Our primary caves, the ones we're looking for, like this little small cave you're looking at there, is one that we excavated this last year. You can see it, and that cave was Cave 52. It had scroll jars at one time in it. By the time we got to it, they were no longer there, but it was a very important cave. All of these caves may or may not have been used by the Qumran community, but it's not a far distance for them to walk and hide these things. And most of these caves they hid in were very obscure caves that you would not think would be used by a person. They had to crawl in on their stomach. They had to come in from a strange direction, and they use those for hiding things. And that's the ones we're looking for. Not caves people necessarily lived in, but caves they used to hide the scrolls, like a repository. They did this because the scrolls had either worn out, they couldn't use them any longer, but they couldn't destroy them, so they hid them away. Or they might have used them, as we do, library shelves. They didn't leave them in the community. Some they did. The cave right in the middle of the screen now is Cave 53 or Cave 12. Here's a close-up of it, which we excavated in 2017, again in 2018. The cave just above it to the right is Cave 53B. And this was the first Dead Sea Scroll cave discovered in over 60 years. No one had looked particularly in this southern area or had believed that it was possible to still have scroll caves. And so you can see this cave in particular, it faced toward the community, toward the Qumran community. There's, even from antiquity, pathways that lead to this. But it's now been excavated, so it's much larger than it looked when we found it. It was almost completely collapsed, and we had to dig out entirely, move huge boulders to get to that. But you can see this walkway. There's kind of little paths that come through there. Hard to see as we look at this, but there's established walkways from antiquity. Same thing in the north, going the other direction toward that green area you see. If you look over to the left, you see high caves. That's where the famous Dead Sea Scrolls themselves were found from the 1940s and 50s.
Right. I mean, 500 caves, there's a lot of caves to then consider. How do you know which cave that you think is the best possibility?
Well, there's a number of factors, and we've been working on that by the process of elimination. First off, in 1993, there was a survey done by the Israelis. They were afraid that when the Declaration of Principles was signed between Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, that was done on the White House lawn to try to make the first efforts toward a peace process. And the Israelis gave up land for peace. So they withdrew from Bethlehem and they withdrew from Jericho, which is right next to Qumran. And it was rumored, in fact, it was actually on a future map where they would remove their troops from Qumran. And so the archaeologists said, look, we may lose access to this place forever. And once it's in the hands, let's say, of the Jordanians or the Palestinians or whoever is going to get this, they're not going to protect the site. They didn't in the past. Looters came in, took things away. Our heritage will be lost and stolen. We need to get in and start at least mapping out in a survey fashion what caves may hold potential. And so that was done in 1993. The results were not published till 2012. And on the basis of those results, plus other types of remote sensing and things that we did, we determined that this particular cave was an ideal candidate, and turned out to be. We have excavated other caves which looked ideal, but were not. Were completely empty. So sometimes it's hit and miss. It's the elevation of the cave, the style of the cave, the orientation of the cave. Sometimes things that don't even look like they could possibly be a cave. Right next to where we excavated in 2017, there was just a tiny little enclosure above it. And I went on off-season looking in there, moved stones, crawled in on my stomach. You couldn't hardly see anything. And I said, let's try this. Everybody was sort of saying, I don't think that can be anything. But when we excavated it, sure enough, it was. It had big chambers. It had nice material inside, scroll jar fragments. It even had a bronze cooking pot, a beautiful thing. And that was just because we took a chance on it. I wish there was some scientific method If you see pottery in front of a cave, yes, someone has possibly been there, but otherwise we don't know. And so we have to get in, and when we excavate, we have to excavate the entire cave. You can't leave any part because there's hidden places everywhere.
Well, let's look at another clip here and explain to us what's happened in the past when you've dug up in this area.
Okay, we're now in the area of Cave 52. We were digging here primarily, and that's in this slide of rocks. To the left, as we're moving away from it, that is Cave 52. The history of that, back in the 50s, a man named Joseph Millick had excavated. He actually crawled into this cave with a dog, and he had seen in the floor of the cave sandy material. He moved that aside, and when he did, he saw the tops of jars. He saw the lids of the jars stacked against the wall of the cave very reverently, and he was excited about it. He knew there were no scrolls there, but he knew it was a scroll cave. He went down to tell Roland DeVoe, who was the excavator, about it. For one reason or another, DeVoe was tired that day, didn't care, and nothing was ever done. We know that Millick probably went back with others and retrieved those jars, but the cave was lost to us. You can see here how people have to get to the site because it's very narrow passageways. One misstep and you're down the cliff. And so we're using harnesses. We have safety ropes through here. There's actually cables we put in, and we use that to get from place to place so we walk securely. We've had no injuries, any kind of incident in our digs because we take these kind of precautions. But this cave, as I'm talking about, was lost. No one knew where it was. But there was one small black and white picture of Millick in the door of this cave. And through our own explorations and looking at places like this, we found the cave. And we went back to excavate it to see if there was more there. There wasn't much more there. These things were hidden in the front of the cave. He found the jars. We found pieces of scroll jars, which confirmed that there were indeed jars there. And we already confirmed the fact that it was Millick's cave. So these are some of the things too. We excavated another cave in the vicinity because we said if this was a scroll cave, maybe a nearby cave that looks very good might be one too. It wasn't. So, you have to get into the mind of these people who did the hiding. Why would they pick this site over another site? And caves like Cave 1 and to the north, there's no entrance whatsoever. It's just a hole that was up at the top of part of the cliff, and they stood on their shoulders and got people in and then handed them jars and they hid them in there. And that's why they were never found. They were found supposedly by a Bedouin shepherd who lost a goat, went looking for it, was throwing rocks into the cave, and then as a result heard the breaking of pottery and climbed in to investigate. Today, archaeologists opened up the entrance, made it themselves, but these are hiding places. These are not places people would go. These are places where they're secreting away these documents. And that's why we have confidence that these things could still exist.
Right. Let's look at another clip as far as what actually happens when you're at the site and you're digging. I think it's very interesting.
In these caves, it's very limited access. They're dark, there's no light. There is, sometimes you share the cave with other creatures. You have to encourage them to leave. You've got these sediments, which are called strata, could go back thousands of years. In fact, in a cave like this, we went down to what we would call the Neolithic period. And that's the earliest part of history, right after the biblical flood. People settled. Some came into this cave, probably a hunting party. We found all these arrowheads, and we found flint knives, and even an obsidian knife, which was extremely sharp, imported from Anatolia. We found a carnelian seal from the Chalcolithic period, which is, again, about 3000 BC. These kind of things were at the lowest level of the cave, but in time, layers were built up on top of that, and then one of the uppermost layers was the one in which the Dead Sea Scrolls would have been deposited in jars. But it takes careful excavation. This is dirt that is blown in, but at the same time, as you see me excavating here, you've got dirt between rocks. Some of this is collapse. The ceilings collapse. You have cave flow that comes in, so you can see between the rocks all of this type of debris. Everything has to be taken out. And in this pocket where I'm digging, you can already see down below part of a jar handle. So they placed pottery items there because of the earthquake activity that exists in this area. These things were broken. All in the area where we're pointing here, there were jars, jar fragments. One was sitting there, and you can see the imprint of the jar. So it's very careful, meticulous work. We have to have headlamps. Sometimes you have to move large rocks like this. These are blocking areas. This was at the entrance to the cave. But at the entrance to the cave, oftentimes they use those. That's like a courtyard and other places. So we found in one case an oil lamp sitting right there at that entrance. They had placed on a little shelf. It got covered up. They used it when they came in and out of the cave to give them light. And so that was still sitting there. And you have to excavate not just in the cave, but outside the cave as well. One of the problems in excavations you can see is an air problem. We have a mask. We have to be very careful because you've got thousands of years of debris. You've got bat guano that produces a toxic type of fumes. You've got all kinds of mold. A lot of dust and stuff comes up. You don't want to breathe that. Right. We have to take all those remains out, and then we have to sift them very carefully because we're looking for small finds. We're in the midst of all of this.
Well, there's some sifting going on right there. Explain this process here.
Things that come out in the buckets, all the buckets are numbered and labeled so we know where they came from, what layer and level they came from. The stuff are put into sifters like this, and then they take out any big pieces to start with, and they sift. This is called dry sifting. The sifting is fine enough that only dirt will pass through, and then they're looking for bits of pottery, possibly artifacts. This is my wife doing this here. She found a number of important things, very small pieces of gauze and pieces of textile, things that were used to wrap the scrolls in the past, even parts of people's garments that were left in the debris in the cave. She found the carnelian seal that was there. And so without very careful looking, once you sift it like this, it looks like you have a lot of rocks. The stuff that's obviously nothing is removed, and then you look very carefully to see if something's there. There can be very, very small items like beads, seeds. We had olive pits. We had date pits. These things indicate what they were doing when they were in the cave. And you can take those items, because they're organic, and you can subject them to carbon-14 testing, and you can determine a relative date for the things in the places you're digging.
Right sitting next to you, you have got some pottery.
These are what scroll jars look like. They were specially made jars at the site of Qumran. Scrolls we put in and a lid put on, and that relatively kept the documents inside from decaying because it's very dry at the Dead Sea. The enemy of papyrus or parchment scrolls like this is humidity. There's very little humidity at that area. And when you put them in a jar like this and seal them in a cave, that's all removed further. And so that's how these things can be preserved. No one, when the Dead Sea Scrolls were first discovered, thought they could be as old as they were because no one had ever found scrolls that old. They just didn't think they could exist. But under these conditions, they can. And that's why it's so important to try to find, even if they're not intact in jars. One year, we did find a part of a parchment in one of the jars. We're trying to determine the kind of writing that might be on it. But we're hopeful that we can find either an intact jar somewhere or at least scroll fragments. All of that is extremely important to helping us with piecing together missing parts of the puzzle of who the people at Qumran were, the history they record, their relationship to events around them, how that fits, how the biblical text has maybe been transmitted with things we call variants. People either made mistakes in copying the text, or they introduced their own little changes sometimes, what they thought were positive changes to help clarify the text. And we have all of that in some of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Well, one of the things I want to point out too is that there are two aspects to your work right now, is that you have done something on the plateau, right? You've got a number of years of work on the plateau, and you're going to be publishing that. That's what we want to help you do, is to publish.
Well, for 10 years, we worked on the Qumran Plateau. DeVoe had excavated from 51 to 57, 6 years, and that work was structures that were visible at the time. He excavated where the people lived. But this whole plateau existed, and no one thought perhaps there was anything there because they couldn't see anything. And we undertook that to tell the rest of the story. And in the process of doing that, we found some structures, some very interesting things. The most interesting thing we found were what we call animal bone deposits. These were just not animals that died and were discarded. These were part of meals that were eaten. The animals were eaten, but then something very strange happened. They took the cooking pots and the things they cooked the meal in. They took the plates they served the meals in. They took the cups and bowls and everything they ate the meal on, and they took those with the remains of the meal and they buried them out on that plateau by the hundreds. And it started at the very early period when the scrolls began to be put in jars and hidden away. We know this because we can date when that happened, and we happen to have one of the Dead Sea Scrolls that tells us about this. It tells us about this communal meal, and it has a messianic connection to it. They look into the future. When Messiah comes, they'll have a great messianic banquet that'll take place in Jerusalem, and they were rehearsing that, in my opinion, at Qumran. But when DeVoe excavated, he found some of these within the community, but they didn't really recognize the significance of them. To a degree they did, but the bones were separated from the pottery. The pottery was put somewhere else. The bones were discarded, and there were no examples of this that remained, just photographs. We've been able to really have hundreds of examples. We've kept some of the examples as they were found. That's going to go into an exhibit at the Israel Museum in Jerusalem very shortly. But we've also been able to catalog all this. We've been able to take the animal bones. We've been able to do a DNA analysis, extract actual DNA, genetic material from the bones. We found the extinct species of goats that were there. We know the time periods. We know the age of the animals, everything about them. And this is very important because they chose young animals. And young animals are animals that are less blemished, in my opinion. Those could produce good skins for the scrolls. What we need to do is complete this research, and we have geneticists ready to do that, standing in the wings to make this research project. And we also need to finish publishing all the material that we have to make the case. We've done everything that's necessary. We've got all the pottery analyzed, we've got all the coins, we've even published a lot of those. Everything that's necessary for a final dig to be published has been done, except for some of these final pieces, and that's where we are today. The other thing is connecting the caves with Qumran, because if the material coming out of the caves can also be compared to the Qumran community, there was the same type of oil lamps, same type of pottery, the same type of other things that we find. If that bears some connection to the community, then we can say these are definitely the people, again, who produced the scrolls and hid the scrolls. And these are unanswered questions at this point. They've not been scientifically researched, and so there's still debate. We'd like to end that debate with some very positive archaeological evidence.
Right, because in a sense there's a archaeological as well as a theological connection here to why these people were here. Wasn't it just a group of mainly men that lived in this community that sort of had separated themselves from the rest of the world, and they were waiting for the Messiah to come? Was this what the nature of this group was?
Some of that's the case, and of course all these points are debated, but I think they were married. Jewish men were normally married. In the cemetery we find the remains of women and children.
Oh, you do?
And the women and children lived outside the community. You think of the Qumran community more like a Jewish yeshiva, like our seminaries. So the men came in the morning. They spent their day studying. They also had different types of watches in the night and study times then. But their society was secretive, but I think they had families. They had documents like the War Scroll, in which they were preparing for an end-time battle that they saw, the Battle of Gog and Magog, they felt was imminent. There are other things in which we see them speaking about personal understanding of the Messiah, things that he would do. They talked about an Aaronic Messiah. They talked about a Mosaic Messiah. They talked about a priestly Messiah. Talked about a Davidic Messiah. In my opinion, they're talking about one Messiah. And these are simply aspects that they see in the scriptures. Remember, no one had put this together. We have no documents that tell us about messianic prophecy and how to interpret it, but they're doing that for us. We don't have that till we come to the New Testament. That's put together. And up to this point, people were only guessing at what people believed at the time of Jesus. They had the New Testament, but of course, for many scholars, the New Testament was written later in time. It was biased. It had a Greek perspective. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, all of a sudden they found the same terminology. They found the same religious viewpoint. They found some of the cultural things. And something like the Gospel of John, which was the latest of the Gospels and had more of a Greek influence, people thought. Now, looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls and looking at the terminology used there, things like the whole concept of predestination, the ideas of sons of light and sons of darkness, which Paul used as well as John. Now they would say John is one of the most Jewish of the Gospels. So it changed our whole perspective of things. And we now know that people before the coming of Jesus had a high messianic expectation. They knew what to look for. And that's why some people believed Jesus when he gave that message. Others didn't. But there was a preparation. When Jesus says, you did not recognize the time of your visitation, how could they have recognized that if they didn't understand what had been previously written in the Old Testament? And we had no verification of that because the Old Testament ends at a certain period. We have this 400 years of what we call silence. That's from the Christian perspective. From the Jewish perspective, a lot was going on. Many voices were speaking. One of those we find at Qumran. And they're telling us the very same things that are written on the pages of the New Testament when they describe the Messiah, place of his birth, that he would be a divine Messiah in many aspects. He would wage a final war. All these things are read about in the scrolls. And that's why they're so important. They give us information we never knew existed. But that information is limited because we only have so many of them.
Right.
We'd like to have more.
Right, and so I learned something here. I didn't know that there was that much of a connection between the prophetic looking at a Messiah with this group of people here. Well, why don't we take another look at some more footage as to what's going on here. I think people will find this fascinating.
All right, here we're digging deep into one of the caves. This is still cave 53, and you can see this is just impacted. When you come to a cave, the whole back of the cave could just be a solid wall. But it's not a wall. It's debris and things that are in there. That has to be all removed. In the case of one cave, as we were digging, we thought we were finished. We noticed the rocks to the side. They looked like they were placed there rather than just falling there. We started getting behind the rocks. Indeed, we could see that was the case. And behind the rocks, we found items. And behind that, we found a huge cavern. And so you have to explain every little nook and cranny. You notice here, as he's been digging, it's opened up new areas. They're hidden now, but at the time when the cave was opened, let's say 2,000 years ago, you had this whole area that could be explored. So he's crawling in there to investigate this passageway.
Let me ask you a quick question. The snakes or scorpions, crawling in caves and snakes, that would give me the willies.
Well, we do have some of those. Not too many. Haven't found too many. Our excavations take place in the winter season because that's when it is about 70 degrees at Qumran. Any other time of the year, it's going to be much hotter and much more humid in terms of working in the caves and make it difficult. That also happens to unfortunately be the time when animals tend to go in and hibernate.
Earthquakes, let's talk about this because these caves at one time were more accessible, weren't they?
Yeah, this Jordan Rift Valley, of which the site of Qumran is a part, right along the Dead Sea, is an earthquake zone. And they happen all the time. There's some major ones in history that have been recorded. For instance, at the Dead Sea community, Qumran, there is a huge split through one of the ritual baths. We know when that happened. And it seems that it collapsed enough at the community that they left for a time and then probably came back. In the caves, you can see it in fallen material everywhere. I mean, it doesn't take much to make them fall. So one of our jobs in going into these caves is we have a safety engineer. We have to hire that person. They come in, we erect scaffolding in places to be sure everyone who works there is safe. And there's no problem like that. So, and we're very careful. We have to be, because any accident might close down our dig. So we do that. Here you can see getting to a certain point and then excavating down. This is more of the marl caves. This is Mika, one of the surveyors with the Israel Antiquity Authority. And the marl caves are a much softer material, much easier to work with, but also more collapsible. Here you see Yaakov Kalman. He is one of our principal staff. He's the director of excavations at Herodian today. He's been working in archaeology 50 years. And you can see here we're putting scaffolding up. So this is pipework and things we're installing to make sure any movable rocks won't collapse. And even those rocks to the right that are stacked up, we stack those up to prevent that shell from falling. But we had to dig back in there because we're finding scroll jars back in that area. And they were hidden there, but then it all was buried and covered up. As we excavated it, the things that had collapsed on top of that now could shift and fall. So we have to make sure all that's secure.
Yeah, you could see that. I mean, it looks almost dangerous because of the way the material is sort of hanging above you, so you'd have to really know what you're doing.
That's why we work very carefully. Every day we have briefings, safety briefings. We talk what we're going to do. We tell how many people can go into the cave. We want to be as safe as possible. We also have to map this cave out. And once it's done, we have surveyors that come in with certain types of equipment that give us a complete reading of the cave. We do as much recording as we can before, and then we do it after to show how we change the cave. Here's Oren Gutfeld, my co-director, crawling into one of these areas. You can see how narrow it is, but they certainly would have done that and brought jars in. Once you get in, you have a wider area to work, and there's others in there working at the time. In K53, one of our major caves that we found, there was a 60-foot long tunnel that was completely buried. When we uncovered that, then we found these bits of jars that hidden along the walls. Even found tools they used to help dig out that tunnel in order to put the jars there. But you have to crawl in like this, and you have to do that work. And that's me sitting there. He came to see me as we worked in this narrow area. So as you can see here, we had, in this particular area, we're digging down to the lowest strata. This is not just floor level. These big rocks, you see how large these are. These had fallen from the ceiling. Sometimes we have to move those. Here's a case on the outside where I dug an oil lamp. This was sitting right there. We'd already dug the area that was in front of it, and now here it is. This comes from the late Hellenistic period, the period when the Dead Sea Scroll community began. And so that gave us an indication clearly of the time period of this whole cave. This was just the first day of the excavation, finding these kind of things. This is Yehuda Rapaango of the Israel Antiquity Authority who's doing our pottery reading here. So some of this is before the time of Jesus, some of it is the time of Jesus. And as you look through this pottery and see what you have, it indicates many things about the cave, who was there, when they were there, and what they used in the cave.
What is this right here?
Yeah, this is textile. It's important to have that kind of material when you get it. This kind of stuff is the gauze or material. They took their own clothing and they used those to wrap up the scrolls and put them within jars. You can see it here, just letting the buckets down. We had to fabricate ways to do this in a safe manner so that those below sifting could get what we have without spilling the contents. It's just too awkward and dangerous to try to take them down by hand. So we had this kind of pulley system worked out. As you can see, from way inside the cave, buckets are being filled and they have to be passed out. And so you have literally hundreds of buckets that are going to come out, and they come from the darkness into the light, and they stacked up, and they have to be moved to the place where they're going to be sifted. The man digging right here is the son of the chief of the Bedouin tribe who discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls initially. He's been working some 50 years out of this area, lives right near Herodian at a place called Beit Sahur, where the shepherd's field mentioned in Bethlehem is.
Okay, see.
Hi, Terry.
This is Terry Telgerman from Texas that's been helping us. What he's doing, this is a survey. Before we excavate, we have to go in these caves, we have to crawl around, we have to see if there's potential, and then we have to get a permit to dig a little bit to see if it's worth doing a full-scale excavation. And that takes a lot of, shall we say, singular devotion.
Boy, it sure does. It would take a lot of work. I mean, a lot of volunteer work is going on here with, volunteers that are trying to find,
Right.
Trained to know what to look for.
You have to be very careful. Every single thing that you bring out of the cave, everything that you find has to be documented as to where it was found, the depth it was found, the bucket it came from. All this makes up a record so that you can explain the history of this cave and where these things were found, what we call things found in situ. And why is that important? Well, in the past, the Dead Sea Scrolls were largely found by Bedouin, who were looters looking in the caves. They sold the scrolls on the black market. They eventually made it to the hands of scholars. But where did they come from? All they had was the word of many of these Bedouin, these itinerant shepherds. And we don't know with real accuracy where many of the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. We just have their stories. So to be able to go to caves ourselves and to find them, and when we find the thing right where it was left 2,000 years ago and document that, now we can say for certain if we find scrolls, they came from this cave. And that makes a difference because it helps us put together the history of the hiding, types of cave, even the date, the actual manuscripts based on the pottery things we find in the caves, which you can't do just from the scrolls themselves.
Well, what's going on here?
All right, here, I mentioned earlier that we came to some fallen stones. When we removed those, we found that we had installations. We had things behind them. In this case, we have a bronze cooking pot, a very rare bronze cooking pot. There's only, as far as I know, 2 others that exist like this from this period. One from Qumran that was found during the Devo excavations. This was in almost a perfect state of preservation. It was put here, and there were rocks that were put in front of it to block it. And once we dug this out, there's a whole chamber behind this. But when this cooking pot comes out, you may have some footage of that later. It was just a beautiful specimen. It even had an engraved, maybe the manufacturer's mark, we're not sure what it is, that's engraved in it. And so this is the kind of thing that we can take and then compare to the finds that came from the plateau or came from DeVoe's excavations. And we can say if we have the same type of cooking pot and they're found nowhere else, then these things must match up historically. It's diligent work, it's difficult work. The guys who do it love it because you realize you're the first hands touching this soil, even touching many of these artifacts in the last 2,000, sometimes 3,000 years. You're making real discoveries. So I say, not only do you have the chance of learning about history on a dig like this, you have the chance of making history. And so this cooking pot, which Yaakov is extracting at this point, is really, he's the first hands to have touched that 2,000 years, 2,000 plus years, really. And it's the finest example right now that's ever been found, a cooking pot in this period from this location. Of course, we sifted the dirt from within this cooking pot to see if something might be stored, and what came out were parts of the handle that suspended this particular cooking pot for cooking. And that was made of iron, so it disintegrated. We have it, but it didn't hold up as well as bronze does. So now we're taking this out. So that was a great find, and there was a hope there would be more things like it, but you don't have things like that every day. It's just not coming out of the caves like this. Now looking inside to see if there's anything else that might be there. You can see this if this were cleaned up, and it has been cleaned up now, it would almost look like came out of the store yesterday. It's that nice a state of preservation, except for the handles that were on top. So this is the kind of thing that is part of the material culture. The people who were using this cave used this to cook their meals. That's why they hid it there, so they could come back. But actually in antiquity, a bronze cooking pot of this order would have been very valuable. So it's considered a treasure that they hid. You can see bits of iron protruding from the two side handles, and we have the entire handle, but as I say, it fell apart, so it has to be put together. When it's going to be exhibited in the museum coming up, that will be part of it.
So as we look at these different finds that you're finding there, you're actually then trying to piece together what happened down at the plateau with what's happening up in the caves and put that to those connections.
Right. I think that has been divorced now in many scholars' minds. And it's primarily because they're looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls from an academic position, never having done any field work. They don't know the history of the excavations. In our case, we have 10 years of excavation we haven't even published. So this material is not even available to them to make decisions. And the cave material has not yet been published. That's what we need to do.
Right.
And when this information is out, then they can factor that in. And I think we're going to change some minds and some ideas. One thing we've already changed is the belief that there was no more things to be found. That's why 60 years went by and there were no more Dead Sea Scrolls. Now we know that that's not the case. There were also hiding places in the south. And that helps us rededicate ourselves to looking more so we can find more. Because if we don't look, no one will. Decades will go by. These places will be left or looted. We're really in a race against time to try to get this information and reveal it to the world. Again, unfortunately, everything like this is expensive. It takes time, and all of us only have so much of both. And so we need help.
So Randall, when I look at who has the experience, and you've had the training, and you've been there a long time, let's just talk about why I think you're the right person to be digging there at this time, and why it's so important that this digging happens now.
Well, in the history of this whole area, in the 50s, you had DeVoe and his team excavate. They were Dominican Catholic. Then, let's say a decade later or more, you had more than that. I would say probably 3 decades later, you had Israelis begin to do some excavation. They were secular in their orientation and in their interpretation of the finds. And then the site was given to me. And for the 10 years I was at Qumran excavating, I held the sole permit. I was the only evangelical Christian to be given that permit. And so in the history of excavation, I'm only the 3rd person that's done this, let's say now 70 years. I will be continuing probably doing this the rest of my life. I'm dedicated right now about 25 years to this site. You gain experience in the digging and the work and the finds you have. You learn to compare that to other sites in the region, such as Jericho, Masada, Herodian, various other sites like this, even Machaerus, which is across the way in Jordan. All of these are from similar periods, had similar type of material. And you have to have that kind of information. And as you stay at a site, you do become one of the experts on the site. What we have in field archaeology is different from people who sit and study this just in an academic way. We have access to primary finds. And this is something they may not have access to because it hasn't been published. And I want to get it published so they who understand very particular areas of Dead Sea life and interpretation and biblical studies can benefit from this. It may change the way they think. It may clarify things that they've never seen before. And so I have that advantage. We went to the caves. I actually was one of the first, along with Orrin Goodfield, to do these excavations in the cave. They hadn't done any in the south. The belief was there was nothing to find. and we were bold enough to challenge that scholarly assumption that there were more scrolls, more scroll caves that could be found. And we're still working there to prove that. We're also dealing with the fact that we're in disputed territory. So this is the so-called West Bank. And politics change. We got in primarily because during the Trump administration, the U.S. was favorable toward the Netanyahu administration doing things in the West Bank. They weren't as concerned about using this territory in future negotiation. They wanted to declare sovereignty over the West Bank, so it opened up that for our work, which hadn't been done previously. Now we have changes in administration. That'll bring changes in foreign policy. The pressures are brought to bear on the Israeli politicians. They may say, don't touch this area. We don't want to be accused of doing things in an area that might be eventually given to others.
So what I want people to know is that getting behind the hidden caves of the Dead Sea Scrolls with Randall Price and his team is really, really important. And if you're a member, we're already behind it, but we need to raise more money for this, and we want to act while we can, because the door might close. We don't know what will be found, but this is the thing that we're trying to do, is help you both publish as well as get to next year's opportunity to dig in 2021. So that's the big opportunity, and we're really thankful for you, Randall. You've done an awful lot of work in this area, and I'm very thankful for the type of things that you've done. Both you and your wife, you have a wonderful wife. We've worked together. She's worked really hard alongside you, and your son has been there, and your family members have been there helping, so they're a part of this team. So once again, we're part of the family, and we want to get behind what Randall is doing and what his team is doing with the hidden caves of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And any closing thoughts, Randall?
Yeah, let me say, all of those who are part of the Historical Faith Society, I'm so grateful for you, because it's this time in history that we need people not who are just partners with archaeology, but people who will stand in support of the scriptures and recognize that they are historical. And archaeology, I think, has been raised up by God in this time to make that kind of evidence so that people can see the things surely to be believed. They can make that case. I wish it was simply a matter of saying, just believe this because God said it. We have people today who don't believe. They need to know. They need to see it. They need to understand it's true. And we have the opportunity, and you have the opportunity, of partnering with people who can make that happen. And I think this is the time to do it. We have a generation that will be lost to us if we don't stand in the gap now.
Well, thank you again, Randall, and we're going to be following this whole journey. We'll be back talking with you again throughout the year, and then hopefully we'll be able to be at the site and do some type of a call while you're there. You can give us a report as to what's happening. So once again, thanks again for being a part of the Historical Faith Society event for March, and God bless you.
Bless you too. Thank you.
In conclusion, I'm so excited to let you know that as a Historical Faith Society member, you and the rest of our community have already helped Dr. Randall Price and his team. The Society has made a $5,000 donation to continue the work of preserving the historical credibility of the Bible. To learn more details about this work, you can go to the Qumran Cave Excavation Project by looking for the project heading. The project is estimated to be $100,000. The funds will be used to pay for the publication of a report concerning the past Qumran findings, as well as funding for the next Qumran cave excavation in 2022. If you'd like to further help Randall and his team reach this goal with a personal financial gift, you can go to the projects page on the Historical Faith Society website and donate. This could be one of the most significant archaeological efforts in the preservation of the Bible's historical credibility. So please tell others that they can also join in the blessing to give to such an important project.